Welcome back. Oh. You are watching Sky News at Breakfast. Snooze, you lose. Let's have a look back now at some of the big stories making the news this week. And joining us to discuss all of that is the Guido Fawkes reporter, Tom Harwood, and senior editor at Novara Media, Eleanor Penny. Welcome to you both. So let's kick off with that interview.
Yeah.
Andrew Neil, Tom, and Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah, well, this was the interview that was really going to set the case for this week. And if it hadn't been for Labour's dead cat, if you want, strategy to move the conversation on the next day, this is what we would have been talking about for the whole week. It was seismic, and you can tell how seismic it was because all the Labour outriders, all the Labour Party politicians had nothing to say on it. They were silent on Twitter, they were silent on the hashtag because it was dreadful for him. This was an interview where he refused to apologise to the Jewish community of this country for the rampant anti-Semitism in his party, where he admitted that people earning as little as £14,000 a year would be whacked with extra tax under Labour, and where he was roundly shown to be running a very dishonest campaign.
I don't know about whacked with extra tax. It was losing £250.
No, that's the marriage allowance.
That was the marriage allowance.
So on £1,400, if you had an annuity or something, you'd lose £400 a year. At the very lowest end, there's lots of insidious tax rises that simply haven't been reported, and Andrew Neil tweezed them out of Jeremy Corbyn.
I'm sorry, that this is just complete fantasy. The idea that there are lots of insidious tax rises is simply inaccurate. The tax rises will be concentrated on the top 5% of earners.
True.
The marriage issue, in terms of equalising the amount of tax that's paid by both married couples and unmarried couples, I support it. I think that that kind of equality, you know, baking that kind of equality into law is something that a progressive government should be standing behind. And listen, we're talking here about people who are paid in dividends. How many of, you know, our viewers are...
Anyone with an annuity?
Is that the majority of this country? No, it absolutely isn't. We're still talking...
Well, it is. That's anyone with a pension, isn't it?
That's still not the majority of the country. And also, the tax rises are only hit after you get over £4,000, I believe, in annuity. And also, we're talking about £250 a year if you get that, if you broach that kind of threshold. And also, that's in return for massively expanded public services. So if we are talking about people with pensions, let's measure that against the increasingly astronomical cost of social care, which under a Labour government you wouldn't have to pay for. And going back to the...
But in terms of that interview, though, I mean, you make the points very succinctly, but he didn't perform well in that interview, did he?
Oh yeah, no, it wasn't Corbyn's finest hour, of course. You know, Andrew Neil really put him through the ringer, which is, of course, why, you know, I would, of course, like to see all party leaders put themselves up to that stump. On the issue of anti-Semitism, I think we need to be very clear here that the chief rabbi is absolutely right to be worried about the rising levels of anti-Semitism and racism of all kinds in this country, but where we would disagree, of course, is to how we diagnose that problem and how we think the solution lies. Because people talk about the Jewish community as though it's this one homogenous block and there's no disagreement between us. Newsflash, disagreeing is kind of what we do. And the chief rabbi, actually, his constituency is only 30% of UK Jewish households, and there's no real consultation there. So let's talk about...
Well, let's just have a look at how Mr Corbyn responded to the chief rabbi's comments.
Abuse of a Jewish family on a train is vile and wrong. Abuse of a Muslim woman walking down the street is vile and wrong. None of it is acceptable, and none of it will ever be acceptable, either within our party, by our party, or by a government that I would be proud to lead, that would be the most anti-racist government you've ever seen, because that is what I've spent my whole life doing, fighting against racism. And I will die fighting against racism in any form. It's a poison and a scourge.
That's pretty strong, Tom.
You're shaking your head there.
He just simply doesn't believe what he has engaged in for the entirety of his career can be defined as racism. He looks at a mural, a blatant anti-Semitic mural that could have come out of Goebbelian propaganda, and he says that that should stay up. He lays wreaths for terrorists who killed Jewish athletes.
Oh, that has been debunked
No, it simply has not. This is a man who stands next to people on rallies time and time again who shout about how we should support Hamas, an organisation that's in its charter,
Do you
wants to push Jews
believe
into the
that Jeremy
sea.
Corbyn himself is anti-Semitic, or that he simply has not handled the complaints put to his party properly? Or do you believe he's anti-Semitic as an individual?
I think Jeremy Corbyn doesn't believe he's anti-Semitic, but I think his actions speak very differently. And there's a reason why the majority of Jewish people in this country believe he is anti-Semitic.
OK, let's step back for a second here, because we can't let that stand. Many people who are Jewish and in the Labour Party support Jeremy Corbyn. Many people who are Jewish who have been around Jeremy Corbyn are very clear on the fact that they haven't detected a hint of anti-Semitism for him. I mean, like John Landsman, the name escapes me, but there's a Labour peer who came over on the kinder transport, and this is about being very clear
Are you saying
about
Jeremy
where
Corbyn's never done anything anti-Semitic?
No, that's not what I'm saying. It's time for you to listen to people who are from those backgrounds, and because you are really being very irresponsible by saying that the biggest racist threat is somehow someone who has spent his life campaigning against racism. Now, I don't deny that the Labour Party has handled internal processes poorly. I have been an outspoken critic on that, for the record. However, we should be very clear that the real threat to all minorities in this country is one government, and that is a Conservative government under Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson...
Based on what?
Because Boris Johnson's administration, both in rhetoric and in policy, has successively demonised minorities of all kinds. Yesterday, the Conservative government unveiled a statue to Nancy Astor, who supported the Nazis because they were promising a solution to the problem of Judaism across the world.
So we're really going to compare unveiling a statue to the first female to take a seat in the House of Commons? We're going to say that's on the same level as sucking up to people,
OK, let's talk about how Boris Johnson
Instead, let's talk about the Tory Manifesto, should we? And Tom, a bit of a damp squib, or just playing it very safe, or well, I mean, there's nothing to get excited about in there.
No, I mean, I think the biggest point about this manifesto is that we've heard it for months. Boris Johnson came out the bat, sort of stood at the steps of Downing Street when he became Prime Minister and told us the big pledges that would have been the surprises of the manifesto. You know, the 20,000 extra police officers, the 20 hospital upgrades, the levelling up of funding of education. These are the rabbits that we'd expect to come out of a hat of a manifesto. But the Tory party have been talking about them for months. So perhaps that's the reason why it didn't feel like the sort of fizz and buzz of a normal campaign, because in reality, this is a Prime Minister and a party that has been on the campaign footing for the last 3 or 4 months.
I mean, let's be very clear that they didn't promise 20 hospital upgrades. They promised 40 new hospitals, and that's been rigorously debunked many times. What I'm astonished by is, as the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which has, reliably been working from the same kind of copybook as small c conservative economists, they've said that this manifesto from the Conservative government bakes in austerity. And to me, it's a really feeble approach.
Well, the IFS also said the Labour manifesto just didn't make any sense financially. I
mean, this is rather my point, right? These are the people who should be supporting the Conservative manifesto, and even they are pretty much saying that this is a really feeble response to the multiple overlapping crises that our country is facing. Climate crisis, a social care crisis, of course, Brexit coming right around the corner. And as an argument in favour of why they should be allowed to rule for another 5 years, let alone 5 years which covers the Brexit negotiations and a key 5 years in tackling the climate crisis, they've really failed to provide an argument as to why.
There's not a clear Brexit policy in there compared to the Labour Party.
I'm not saying it's a clear Brexit policy. I'm saying it's a bad Brexit policy, because the idea that the Conservatives will get Brexit done in any meaningful sense is completely bogus.
It's simply true. The deal's coming back before Christmas. It will be voted through if there's a Conservative majority, and then we'll move on to the other issues.
Passing a bill is not the end of Brexit. It is literally simply the beginning. It is a blueprint for future trading relations.
Let's have a look at why the reason of Brexit has taken up so much political bandwidth. There have been people standing outside Parliament shouting at MPs MPs. There have been discussions, meaningful votes. There have been prime ministers who have fallen. There have been indicative votes. This is all parliamentary wrangling. Once you pass
Heaven
the deal...
forfend that we have a democratic process.
Once you pass the deal, you get outside that stage of parliamentary wrangling. It becomes a process of technical trade talks with civil servants. It no longer becomes that big bandwidth political issue that has been quashing everything else for the last 3 years.
Fair point.
We move
get on with everything else.
So, Boris Johnson actually had support for his bill. All that parliamentarians wanted to do is to introduce a basic level of scrutiny and a sensible timetable in which a bill that sort of proposes some massive changes to our country could be scrutinised and examined, and that is the least you would ask of such a
Ella and Tom, you're going to have to continue this in the green room because we have run out of time. But as we know, Brexit does get people talking and talking. And thank you very much for coming in this morning. Thank you.
Quick check on the weather for you now.